In 1998, at a middle school tucked away in the quiet suburbs of Ohio, something occurred that remains unexplained to this day. A story whispered among former students, a story ignored by administrators, and a story erased from official records. But those who were there, those who lived it, still talk about the substitute teacher who walked into their classroom and never seemed to leave. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Substitutes came and went in schools like this all the time. Most students welcomed the change. Substitutes usually meant an easier day, less structure, and a chance to pass notes or daydream. But this substitute wasn't like the others. The children noticed it immediately. Her name, written on the board in looping cursive, was unfamiliar. Mrs. Vera. No one had heard of her before, and she never introduced herself. She didn't speak more than a few clipped instructions, and when she did, her voice carried a strange flatness, as though the words themselves cost her something. Students recalled that she never sat at the teacher's desk. She hovered at the edges of the room, her leather bag clutched tightly to her side. Her gaze fixed on the walls or the windows, never the children themselves. Most substitutes brought books, papers, or snacks to get through the day. She brought nothing. She barely seemed alive in the way she moved, drifting more than walking, pausing mid-step as though she were listening to something only she could hear. By the second day, the children noticed her habits, or rather, the absence of them. She didn't drink water, though the room grew stiflingly hot from an old radiator that never stopped hissing. She didn't eat, though lunch break gave her nearly an hour to do so. And most disturbingly, she never once left the classroom, not for the bathroom, not for the teacher's lounge, not even for a brief walk down the hall. The students began to joke nervously. Maybe she was a robot, maybe a vampire, maybe a ghost. But the jokes soon faded when the atmosphere itself began to change. They described the air in that classroom as heavier than anywhere else in the school, as if the walls were pushing inward. The lights overhead seemed to dim ever so slightly, though no one could explain why. Even sound carried differently. Whispers echoed too loudly, and laughter died the moment it left a child's mouth. Something in that room devoured joy, and the longer Mrs. Vera remained, the more the children felt it. On the third day, curiosity overtook fear. A boy named Jason, one of those kids who always pushed boundaries, decided to sneak a look inside her bag. She had stepped briefly into the hallway, though none of the students remembered hearing the door open or close. Jason slid the bag forward, its old leather creaking with a dry sound, as if it had been sitting in a damp attic for decades. Inside, stacked neatly, were photographs. Dozens, no, hundreds of them. He pulled out a handful, expecting to see family snapshots or scenic postcards, but what he saw chilled him. Every photograph was of a child, none from their school, none anyone recognized. Some were faded Polaroids from the 1970s, the kind with washed-out colors and awkward smiles. Others were black and white portraits, children staring stiffly into the lens, their expressions blank. There were no names written on the back, no dates, no locations, just rows upon rows of young faces, all captured in moments that felt too still, too forced, too lifeless. Jason dropped the stack back into the bag, his own face pale, his laughter gone. He told no one what he had seen at first, but the silence spread like a sickness among the students who had caught a glimpse. From that moment, the classroom itself seemed to turn hostile. The children swore they saw shadows move across the walls, shapes that didn't belong to anyone sitting there. A girl reported hearing her name whispered when the substitute's lips hadn't moved. Another claimed that the faces in the photographs looked like they were shifting, their expressions changing when no one was watching. No teacher, no principal, no adult seemed to notice. Mrs. Vera continued to stand at the front of the class, silent, still, as though she were waiting. The official records from that week are incomplete. The school claims no substitute by the name of Mrs. Vera was ever hired. Employment agencies in the area have no record of her either. Yet dozens of students, now adults, all tell the same story. They remember her pale hands, her stillness, the smell of old paper that followed her, and the bag filled with faces that didn't belong. They remember the growing fear in their stomachs, the sense that they were being studied, cataloged, collected. And they remember most of all that she never left the classroom. Not once. From the first bell to the last, she remained inside those four walls. The door locked behind her, the children trapped in silence. Some even claim they saw her still there, long after dismissal, standing motionless in the window as the sun went down. This is where the story begins to fracture, where rumor bleeds into memory, and memory into something darker. Some students believe she was a ghost, a lingering spirit bound to that room. Others whisper that she was something far older, something that fed not on food or water, but on the very energy of children, capturing them in photographs, stealing pieces of their innocence, their youth, their souls. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Mrs. Vera was not a substitute teacher in any ordinary sense. She was something else, something that schools even now refuse to acknowledge. And the photographs? They were never seen again. Jason swears he put them back, swears he never touched them after that day. But when investigators, decades later, dug into the story, they found nothing. No photographs, no bag, no trace of the woman who carried them. Just the memories of children who grew up too quickly, who left that classroom with eyes a little darker, a little more hollow than before. As the week went on, the tension in that classroom only worsened. Students reported nausea, headaches, sudden fevers that disappeared once they left the room. Some claimed to see faces pressed against the windows from the inside, though the blinds were always drawn. Others swore they saw themselves among the photographs, their own faces staring back at them with blank expressions. Fear grew so intense that even the bravest children stopped speaking. The classroom became a tomb of silence, a place where time stretched and warped, where the clock hands seemed to hesitate before moving forward. By the end of the week, the substitute vanished. She did not return for the following Monday. There was no farewell, no explanation. The school denied ever hiring her. The official teacher returned, confused, when students bombarded her with questions she couldn't answer. And for decades since, those children, now adults, have lived with the memory of Mrs. Vera, the substitute who never left the classroom, and the photographs that seemed to hold more than just images. The following Monday, when the regular teacher returned, the students breathed a sigh of relief. But the relief didn't last. Something had changed in that classroom, and no amount of routine could wash away what lingered in the walls. The children sat at their desks and tried to focus, but their eyes kept drifting to the corner where Mrs. Vera had stood, motionless day after day. It was empty now, yet they swore the air still felt heavier there, as though her presence hadn't left at all. Some of them began to talk, cautiously at first. They described hearing whispers at night, faint voices calling their names. A girl said she dreamt of a dimly lit classroom where dozens of children sat frozen, staring blankly at the front of the room. When she looked closer, she realized those children were the same faces from the photographs. One boy admitted that he couldn't sleep because every time he closed his eyes, he saw her reflection in the window, even though she was gone. Years later, many of those students would say the same thing, that Mrs. Vera never truly left. She became a part of them, haunting not just their memories but their very sense of safety. Even as adults, some still refuse to talk about her, convinced that speaking her name is enough to bring her back. There were strange after effects within the school itself. Teachers reported cold spots in the classroom. Custodians complained about the lights flickering, even after the fixtures had been replaced. The principal dismissed it as wiring issues, but the electrician insisted nothing was wrong. One janitor, interviewed years later, recalled unlocking that classroom late at night and swearing he saw a figure standing by the window. When he turned on the light, the room was empty. Rumors spread quickly among students. They said if you stayed late after school and walked past that room, you'd see her pale hand pressed against the glass, Others whispered that she appeared in the reflections of the hallway lockers, her eyes watching, unblinking. Some even claimed that if you sat quietly in the classroom with the lights off, you could hear the soft rustle of photographs being shuffled through, even though no one was there to move them. The strangest detail, and the most chilling, comes from the parents. Several reported that their children's behavior changed after that week. They became withdrawn, silent, unwilling to go to school. Some drew pictures of the photographs, crude sketches of children with empty eyes. One parent claimed her son had a stack of drawings, each one of the same woman, thin face, dark eyes, hair tied in a bun. When she asked him who it was, he whispered, "The teacher who never leaves." The parent assumed it was imagination, until other parents shared nearly identical experiences. But here is where the story twists into something darker. A local historian, fascinated by the case, began digging into old records. What he found was unsettling. Reports of a woman with the same description appearing in schools across the Midwest, stretching back decades. Always as a substitute, always staying for a brief time, always vanishing without trace. In each case, students remembered the same details, the stillness, the silence, the photographs. And in each case, the schools denied her existence. Some speculate she was never alive in the first place. Perhaps she was a spirit, bound to classrooms, feeding on the young. Others believe she was something worse, an entity that took human form, using schools as hunting grounds, collecting children not in body, but in memory, in essence. The photographs, they say, weren't mementos. They were prisons. Each face captured was a child whose innocence, whose soul had been taken. The truth may never be known. The photographs themselves were never recovered. Jason, the boy who first looked inside the bag, carries the memory with him even now. In an interview years later, he admitted he sometimes dreams of those faces, dreams that they're calling to him, begging him to release them. He's convinced that by touching the photographs, he became marked, connected somehow to whatever Mrs. Vera was. There are those who dismiss the story, of course. Skeptics argue that children are prone to exaggeration, that memories warp over time, that urban legends grow from whispers. But skeptics can't explain the consistency. Dozens of children, now adults, scattered across different states, telling the same story of a substitute teacher no one hired, no one dismissed, and no one recorded. Perhaps the most disturbing detail is this. Every few years, new stories surface. A middle school in Indiana, a rural district in Illinois, a suburban school in Michigan. Each time, the same description. A quiet woman who never leaves the classroom, who never eats, who never drinks, who carries a bag of photographs filled with unfamiliar faces. Each time, the school insists no such substitute was ever hired. So what was she? A ghost, a demon, a collector of souls? Or something else entirely, something we have no words for? Whatever the case, one fact remains. She is still out there. Somewhere, right now, a classroom door may be closing, and a group of children may be sitting in silence, feeling the air grow heavy. Their laughter die, their joy drain away. They may be looking at the woman who stands motionless at the front of the room, her bag resting at her side, filled with photographs that should not exist. And if you ever walk into a classroom and the substitute never leaves, remember this story. Remember the faces in the photographs, and ask yourself, when the bell rings and the day ends, will you be allowed to walk out the door? Or will your face join the others in her collection, staring blankly forever, trapped in a bag carried by a woman who doesn't belong to this world? In every school, there are rules that teachers and students alike must follow. Bells ring, doors open, doors close. Classrooms breathe with life during the day, then fall silent in the evening. But sometimes, those doors, those ordinary, unremarkable doors, hold secrets of their own. This story is about a substitute teacher, a locked classroom, and the 30 children who sat trapped inside one afternoon, in what would become the most disturbing day of their lives. The year was 2004. The location, a small town in northern Michigan. A place surrounded by forest, where winters bit hard and summers were fleeting. On this particular day, the school itself seemed ordinary: beige hallways, polished linoleum floors, and the faint smell of cafeteria pizza drifting down the corridors. The students weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary. They had social studies right after lunch, and their usual teacher, Mr. Redfield, was out sick. That meant a substitute, someone new. For middle school kids, that usually meant an easy day, maybe even a chance to slack off. But the substitute who walked into room 112 that day was not what they expected. She was tall, uncomfortably tall, one student would later say, as though her legs were just a little longer than they should have been. Her black skirt brushed the floor, hiding her shoes, and she wore a blouse that looked like it belonged in another decade. Her hair was a sheet of iron gray, pulled back so tightly it gave her features a rigid, almost waxy quality. The children noticed something immediately. She didn't carry a bag or a clipboard or even a pen. She just stepped inside, closed the door, and stood there in front of the blackboard. At first, there was a hush. Middle schoolers are quick to sense when something's off, but they also tend to laugh it off just as quickly. A boy in the back whispered, "She looks like a ghost," and a ripple of nervous giggles passed through the room. The substitute didn't acknowledge it. She didn't smile, didn't frown. She simply wrote her name on the blackboard in letters that were painfully neat. Ms. Lynn. No first name, just that. She then turned to face the class and said something peculiar. Her voice was low, almost flat, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Once the door closes," she told them, "no one is to leave until the lesson is complete." The kids shifted in their seats. Some smirked, others shrugged. Teachers said strange things sometimes, and substitutes often tried too hard to sound authoritative. But then the bell rang in the hallway, the shrill tone marking the start of class, and the door to room 112 swung shut on its own. It clicked, loudly. And when one of the kids, a girl named Rachel, got up a few minutes later to sharpen her pencil, she found the door wouldn't open. The knob twisted, but the latch stayed firmly locked. "Excuse me," she said, turning back toward the teacher's desk. "It's stuck." The substitute didn't even glance up from the paper she had begun writing on. "It isn't stuck," she said calmly. "It's locked." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Teachers rarely locked their doors from the inside, except during safety drills. But this wasn't a drill. Everyone knew it. The hall outside was still full of footsteps and chatter, muffled through the thin walls. They were supposed to be part of that ordinary routine. Instead, they were sealed in. For the first half hour, the class tried to shake it off. The substitute, Ms. Lynn, instructed them to take out their textbooks and turn to a chapter that none of them remembered being assigned. The words in the book seemed normal enough at first. Maps, history lessons, passages about the founding of settlements. But as the children read, they noticed odd things. Dates that didn't exist. Towns that had never been built. Names that belonged to no one they had ever heard of. One page described a fire that cleansed the valley of its children. Another mentioned the gathering of 30 souls, bound in one room. It was unnerving. But every time a student raised a hand to ask a question, the substitute simply replied, "Keep reading." By the second hour, the mood in the classroom had shifted. Whispered jokes had faded into restless silence. The air grew heavier, as though the room itself were shrinking around them. Several students tried the door again, pulling harder this time, rattling the frame. It wouldn't budge. When they looked out the window, the hallway beyond was empty. Eerily empty, considering the other classes should have been in session. That's when the lights began to flicker. Not all at once, but in uneven, unsettling rhythms. Shadows stretched across the walls, long and sharp, until they looked like claws reaching from corner to corner. The substitute didn't react. She sat perfectly still at her desk, hands folded, eyes fixed on the class. One boy whispered, "She's not even blinking." Another leaned forward and whispered back, "I don't think she's breathing." And then, just when the fear seemed ready to tip into chaos, Rachel, the girl who had tried the door first, noticed something written on the board beneath the teacher's name. The chalk letters had not been there before. She was certain of it. But now, in thin looping script, a phrase had appeared. "The lesson is not over." Her heart thudded in her chest. She nudged her deskmate, pointing toward the words. He froze. The substitute hadn't written them. She hadn't moved. Yet there they were, white and sharp against the black slate. The room fell into a tense silence. And then, without warning, the classroom clock stopped ticking. The second hand froze in place. The sound of children breathing filled the room, too loud in the absence of the clock's steady rhythm. Someone stifled a nervous laugh. Someone else whispered a prayer. One boy, his name was Jason, stood and shouted, "This isn't funny anymore. Unlock the door." The substitute slowly turned her head toward him. For the first time since entering the room, she smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was not a reassuring smile. It was a smile of someone who knows something you do not. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a chill that silenced everyone else. "The door," she said, "is not meant for you." The words lingered in the stale air like smoke. The children sat frozen, staring at her, staring at the locked door, at the unmoving clock, at the words on the blackboard that no one had written. That's when Jason noticed something else. On the substitute's desk, half covered by a sheet of paper, was a small brass key. But the key was bent, warped, twisted into a shape that no lock could possibly accept. The kids uncover unsettling writing in their own notebooks. Whispers begin to crawl out of the walls, and the realization that time outside the room no longer moves the same as inside. Each moment they spend in room 112 brings them closer to something they cannot yet name. The key sat on the desk like bait, gleaming faintly under the flickering fluorescent lights. Jason stared at it, his hands trembling at his sides. Every instinct told him to grab it, to try it in the lock, to break free. But something about the way it was bent, the unnatural curl of the metal, the way it seemed to twitch under the light, made him hesitate. The substitute noticed his gaze. She didn't stop him. She only said, "Keys are useless when the door is not real." The words sent a ripple of dread through the classroom. Not real, what did that mean? Rachel whispered, "She's crazy." But the doubt in her voice betrayed her. Deep down, every child in that room sensed the awful truth. This wasn't just a strange substitute teacher. This was something else. Jason reached anyway. He snatched the key from the desk. It was colder than ice, so cold it burned his palm. He hissed and dropped it, the brass clattering to the floor. When it hit the linoleum, it didn't sound like metal at all. It sounded wet. Everyone flinched. And when they looked down, the key wasn't there anymore. Only a dark stain remained, spreading outward in the shape of a handprint. That's when the whispers began again. They weren't coming from the substitute, or from any of the students. They were crawling out of the walls. Soft at first, like dozens of voices murmuring at once. "Too many to count. Let us out." They never opened the door. The lesson never ends. The children covered their ears, but the whispers slid through their fingers, pressing into their skulls. The substitute stood slowly from her chair. For the first time since the bell had rung, she moved with purpose. She crossed the classroom with steps that were too long, her skirt dragging across the floor like fabric soaked in water. She stopped at the blackboard. Without turning, she raised her hand. The chalk lifted on its own and began writing across the board in rapid strokes. The students watched in stunned horror as sentence after sentence appeared. One room, 30 children, no escape. The door is locked because you are the lesson. The clock stopped because time is not yours anymore. Panic finally broke loose. Chairs scraped back. Children pounded on the door, screamed out the window, kicked at the walls. But the hallway outside was still empty. The glass showed nothing but endless darkness, and the door wouldn't budge no matter how hard they struck it. Rachel clutched her desk, tears running down her cheeks. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from us?" The substitute turned then, slowly, and her face was no longer rigid and waxy. It was blurred. Features melted, eyes too dark, mouth stretched too wide. A face not meant to be seen. "What do I want?" she said. Her voice was layered now, as though 30 voices spoke in unison. "I want the lesson to be remembered." The children froze, and in that moment, every single one of them felt something shift inside their heads. Their notebooks, those spiral-bound pages they had been scribbling in earlier, were no longer filled with maps and fake towns. The words had changed. Now every page contained names. Names they recognized. Their own names. Over and over, line after line, written in handwriting that wasn't theirs. Jason dropped his notebook with a cry. Rachel tore pages out, but the names reappeared faster than she could rip them. Every student flipped frantically through their books, but every page said the same thing. You are the lesson. The whispers swelled. The air pressed heavier. The lights burned hot, then flickered out completely. For a few seconds, the classroom was black. Only breathing, sobbing, and the scrape of shoes against the floor filled the void. Then, the clock ticked once. The lights snapped back on, and half the desks were empty. 15 children gone, just gone. No trace, no sound, no explanation. The ones who remained screamed, calling out their classmates' names, searching under desks, pulling open cabinets. But there was nothing. The substitute didn't look surprised. "Half the lesson is complete," she said. Her voice was calm, almost proud. The surviving children huddled together. Jason, pale and shaking, whispered, "We have to do something. We can't just wait to disappear." But the door was still locked. The windows showed only blackness, and the substitute was watching them with eyes that seemed to stretch too wide, too deep. Time dragged. Minutes, hours, none of it made sense anymore. The clock on the wall ticked forward, then backward, then stopped again. Each time the second hand froze, more desks were empty. 10 left, then 8, then 5. By the end, only Rachel and Jason remained. They clutched each other's hands, the last two souls in room 112. Desks all around them sat empty, but the air was thick with whispers of those who had once occupied them. Rachel sobbed, "Why us? Why are we still here?" The substitute leaned down close. Her face loomed larger than it should have, her breath cold as winter. "Because someone has to tell the story." And with that, she turned and walked to the door. She opened it easily, as though it had never been locked. Light spilled into the hallway. Ordinary fluorescent school light. Students walked past outside, laughing, carrying books, oblivious. Rachel and Jason stared in disbelief. They bolted toward the doorway. But when they looked back just once, the substitute was gone. Only the chalkboard remained, words scrawled across it in frantic white script. "The lesson never ends." The two stumbled into the hallway, gasping, trembling, desperate for help. But no one they spoke to believed them. Teachers insisted they'd been in class all day, perfectly normal. No one had vanished. No one had seen the substitute. And when they tried to show their notebooks, those pages filled with their names, the books were blank. Empty. Rachel and Jason never forgot what happened in room 112. As adults, they rarely spoke of it. But whenever they passed a school, whenever they heard the ring of a classroom bell, they felt the weight of that locked door in their chests. Some lessons, it seemed, never ended. Every classroom is a stage. Rows of desks, chalkboards, notebooks, and nervous laughter. A place where children learn, grow, and spend hours of their lives under the watchful eye of whoever stands at the front of the room. But what happens when the one standing there doesn't belong? When the person guiding the lesson knows far too much? Not just names, but thoughts, secrets, futures. This is the story of a substitute teacher who walked into a high school in rural Nebraska in 1995. A teacher who knew things she shouldn't teach. A teacher who left behind a trail of questions that have never been answered. It began on an ordinary Wednesday morning. The sun had just burned through the heavy fog that settled over the cornfields, and the halls of Bright River High were alive with chatter. In room 204, the sophomore English class was waiting. Their teacher, Mrs. Clark, was out for the week on medical leave, which meant a substitute would be filling in. Most students expected an older man with thinning hair, or a tired-looking woman with a stack of worksheets. Someone forgettable, someone temporary. But when the substitute walked in, silence followed her. She was tall, not unusual, but there was something in her posture that commanded attention. She wore a long gray dress that brushed against the floor, and her eyes were a sharp, piercing blue. Students later said she seemed ageless. Not young, not old, but somewhere in between, as though her face couldn't decide which direction to take. She didn't introduce herself in the usual way. No nervous smile, no "Good morning, class." Instead, she turned to the chalkboard and wrote a name, Miss Ainsley. Then, without looking at the roster, she began calling out students' names, one by one, perfectly. David Turner, Sarah Gibbons, Mark Hollis. Each student raised a hand in startled silence. They glanced at one another, puzzled. Some thought she must have peeked at the attendance sheet earlier. Others noticed something stranger. She didn't just say their names. She said them in the exact way their parents did at home. Intonation, rhythm, nicknames even. When she got to Sarah Gibbons, she said, "Sarah Elizabeth Gibbons, sit up straight." No one in that room had ever heard her middle name. Sarah's face flushed. The substitute's gaze swept over the class. She didn't smile, she didn't explain. She simply said, "I don't need a list. I already know who you are." The students tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. As the lesson began, it became clear this would not be a typical substitute day. She didn't hand out worksheets or ask them to read quietly. Instead, she began talking about literature in a way that made them uneasy. She spoke of books no one had read, stories no one had heard of, tales of children trapped in places that didn't exist, of families torn apart by secrets buried deep. And as she spoke, she would turn to individual students and lock eyes with them. "You know what it's like to feel invisible, don't you?" she asked one boy. "You've been thinking about leaving, haven't you?" she whispered to another. One by one, she pulled threads from their lives. Things they had never shared. Things no one else could possibly know. Mark Hollis, a football player, laughed and called it a trick. "You're just guessing," he said. Ms. Ainsley tilted her head. "Then explain why your brother hides his cigarettes in the shed behind your house, the ones your father will find tomorrow morning." Mark froze. His smirk collapsed into horror. Because she was right. The class went silent. This was no trick, and that was only the beginning. By the second hour, the substitute wasn't teaching anymore. She was unraveling them. She told Sarah, in front of everyone, that she should stop worrying about the phone call she had received late the night before, that the number wasn't really a stranger. It was someone she knew, and she'd find out soon enough. Sarah's hands shook. She hadn't told a soul about that phone call. She turned to Jason, a quiet boy in the back, and said, "You should be careful on your bike ride home this afternoon. There's a truck that won't stop at the intersection." Jason's face went pale. The other students whispered nervously. Some tried to laugh. Others avoided her gaze entirely. But no matter where they looked, they could feel her eyes following them. It was as if she were peeling back layers of their lives with every glance. One student, a girl named Emily, finally raised her hand. "How do you know all this?" she demanded. "Who are you?" For the first time, the substitute smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "I know because I listen," she said. "I know because the walls remember. I know because your voices don't stop when the bell rings. They echo." The class shifted uncomfortably. Emily pressed further. "That doesn't make any sense." The substitute leaned forward. Her eyes gleamed. "Doesn't it? Don't you sometimes hear your own thoughts repeating long after you've had them? Don't you wonder why the same nightmare comes back, again and again? That's not your mind, that's me. I'm what's left after the story ends." The words sent a chill through the room. And then, without warning, she began reciting, word for word, Emily's private journal entry, the one she kept hidden under her mattress at home. The girl's face crumpled. "Stop!" she cried. "How do you stop?" But the substitute didn't stop. She read every painful word as though it had been her own. By the time she finished, Emily was sobbing into her arms. The rest of the class stared in silence. This was no ordinary substitute. This was something else. Something that fed on their secrets. At lunch, the students expected her to leave the classroom, to give them space, to let them breathe. But she didn't move. She sat at the desk, hands folded, eyes closed. When one boy tried to slip out early, she spoke without opening her eyes. "The cafeteria pizza is burnt today. You won't like it." He froze, turned pale, and sat back down. Minutes later, when the rest of the students returned from lunch, they found her exactly as they'd left her. Sitting, waiting, knowing. That afternoon, the class grew desperate. They whispered to one another, trying to plan ways to catch her off guard, to prove she was just guessing. But every time they thought something, she interrupted. "Don't bother," she said once, just as David was about to nudge the girl next to him. "Your idea won't work." They froze. "How?" he began. She cut him off. "Because you thought it." And that was when the truth began to sink in. She wasn't just guessing. She wasn't reading body language. She was in their heads. By the end of the day, the class was unraveling. Some were in tears. Others sat rigid and silent, afraid to think, afraid to breathe. The substitute stood before them and said one final thing before the bell rang. "Tomorrow you'll understand." And with that, she walked out the door. The students sat in stunned silence. When the principal entered a few minutes later to check in, they begged him not to bring her back. They explained what had happened, the things she had said, the secrets she had revealed. But the principal only frowned. "What substitute?" he asked. "Mrs. Clark is returning tomorrow. You didn't have a substitute today." The room fell into a deeper silence than before, because every student in room 204 knew what they had seen, knew what they had heard, knew what they had felt. And none of them ever forgot the substitute who knew too much. By lunchtime, the unease in the classroom had grown into something palpable. The substitute, with her unsettling knowledge and calm voice, had begun to fracture the group of students. Whispers darted across the cafeteria tables like sparks. Who was she, really? How did she know so much? But that was only the beginning. Because the true horror was not that she knew what had already happened. It was that she seemed to know what was about to happen next. The first sign came during fifth period. A boy named Ryan sat at his desk, nervously spinning a pen between his fingers. The substitute looked up from the attendance sheet and said, as casually as if she were commenting on the weather, "Don't do that, Ryan. You're going to drop it. And when you bend down to pick it up, your chair will tip. You'll hit your head against the edge of the desk." The room froze. Ryan stopped spinning the pen, cheeks flushing red. He forced a laugh, muttering, "Yeah, right." He flicked the pen again, almost defiantly, and then it slipped. In the split second that followed, everything unfolded exactly as she had said. The chair tipped, the desk corner struck his temple, and Ryan crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain. The substitute didn't flinch, didn't even look up. She merely said, "I told you," and resumed her silent writing. The room was dead silent except for Ryan's groans. And then, slowly, students began shifting their desks away from her. By now, the whispers weren't just speculation. They were accusations. She's not a teacher. She's not even human. She knows things she shouldn't. One girl claimed she saw her eyes shift color for a brief second, from gray to a deep, unnatural black. Another swore her reflection didn't show up in the window glass during last period. And yet, when anyone tried to confront her, the substitute simply smiled with that calm, impossible patience and replied, "You already know the answer." Secrets revealed. The spiral continued after lunch, when she began casually dropping personal revelations into the middle of her lessons. "Caroline," she said suddenly, fixing her gaze on the quietest girl in the room, "your mother's ring isn't lost. It's in the third drawer of your father's desk. He never told you because he was keeping it to pawn for cash. He's ashamed." Caroline went pale. She had never told anyone the story of that missing ring. Minutes later, the substitute turned to another student. "Daniel, you should stop lying to your girlfriend. She already knows about Sarah. She just hasn't told you yet." Daniel's face drained of blood. Half the class stared at him in shock. The other half stared at her in terror. It went on like this, one revelation after another. Little cruelties, deep shames, family secrets never spoken aloud. and with each new revelation the room grew colder, as if the air itself were feeding on the fear she sowed. By seventh period, students were openly begging to leave the room. Some faked bathroom passes, others asked to see the nurse. But every time someone reached the door, the substitute would quietly say, "Sit back down." And they did. It wasn't a command in tone, no raised voice, no threat, just a simple statement. But each time the student froze, turned, and walked back to their desk. No one understood why. It was as though her words carried a weight heavier than choice itself. And when one boy finally resisted, when he stormed toward the door, muttering that this was all insane, she whispered something too low for anyone else to hear. The boy stopped. His face went pale. Then he sat back down, trembling. No one ever found out what she had said to him. He refused to speak about it afterward. Predictions turned dark. Toward the final class of the day, her predictions grew darker. No longer about pens and chairs or missing rings. Now she spoke of deaths. "You," she said to a boy in the back, "don't drive home tonight. Your brakes are going to give out. You won't survive the turn near the quarry." "You," she told another, "be careful walking home. There's a man in a blue truck who has been watching you. He isn't who you think he is." The students sat frozen, hearts pounding, torn between disbelief and the haunting suspicion that she was right. And then she spoke the words that would never leave them. "One of you won't be coming back to school tomorrow." Panic erupted. Students shouted, demanding answers, threatening to call the principal. Some cried openly. The substitute stood calmly at the chalkboard, writing her lesson notes in that elegant, controlled handwriting. She never raised her voice. When the principal finally entered, having been called by a terrified teacher from across the hall, he demanded to know what was going on. The substitute turned, smiled, and said softly, "You shouldn't have come in." Before anyone could react, the lights flickered. The sound of chalk on the board grew deafening, echoing like claws against stone. And then the board itself cracked down the middle. Students screamed, chairs overturned, papers flew. But the substitute stood unmoving, watching with eyes that no longer looked human, eyes black as void. When the lights came back on, the principal was gone, vanished. His clipboard lay on the floor, his glasses on the desk, but he was nowhere to be found. The next day, the substitute was gone too. No record of her employment remained in the system. No application, no resume, no fingerprints. And as for the principal, he was never found. Police searched the building, the grounds, the surrounding woods. Nothing. The official story was that he left town suddenly, some kind of breakdown. But the students knew better, because every one of them remembered the last thing the substitute had written on the chalkboard, just before the lights went out. Some knowledge costs more than you can afford to pay. Years later, those students still refused to speak of that day. Some dropped out entirely. Some moved away, claiming the school was cursed. And while the official records listed as an unexplained disappearance, the students who sat in that classroom know the truth. The substitute wasn't a teacher. She wasn't even human. She was something else entirely. Something that fed on secrets, thrived on fear, and left nothing but silence behind. In every school district across the country, substitute teachers come and go without much notice. They fill in when the regulars are out sick, step into classrooms where names blur together, and vanish at the end of the day. But in one rural district, tucked away in a quiet town most people drive through without remembering, there was one substitute who left behind more than just a strange memory. She left behind questions that no one has ever been able to answer, and a stack of papers that chilled investigators to their core. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The 7th grade math teacher at Ridgeway Middle School had called in sick the night before, leaving the district scrambling for coverage. According to official records, no substitute had been assigned. The district's database showed the job unfilled. Yet when students filed into room 12 that morning, a woman was already there, standing at the chalkboard, writing her name in neat cursive. She introduced herself simply as Ms. Gray. Students later described her as plain, almost forgettably so. Medium height, dark hair pulled into a bun, glasses perched low on her nose. There was nothing outwardly unusual about her appearance. And yet, as the day unfolded, they would all admit there was something about her presence that unsettled them from the very beginning. At first, nothing seemed overtly wrong. Ms. Gray took attendance, pronouncing each student's name perfectly on the first try. Too perfectly. One student recalled whispering to a friend, "She didn't even look at the sheet. How did she know?" When asked later, multiple students swore she never glanced down at the paper. Her eyes remained fixed on them, calm and unblinking, as she called out each name in order. The first ripple of unease passed through the class, but it was quickly dismissed. After all, what substitute doesn't have a roster? The lesson that made no sense. The unease grew when Ms. Gray began the day's lesson. She turned to the chalkboard and began writing equations. At first, they looked like ordinary algebra problems, but soon the symbols grew strange. Shapes that weren't numbers, letters that didn't belong to any known formula. "This isn't math," one student whispered. Ms. Gray never explained the work. She never called on anyone to solve the problems. She simply filled the board with symbols, line after line, murmuring softly under her breath as she wrote. When asked later, students described the sound of her voice as not English, a string of syllables that seemed too quick, too fluid, to be a language they recognized. By the time the board was full, she turned back to the class, smiled faintly, and said, "Now you understand." No one did, but not a single student dared to say so out loud. Elsewhere in the building, teachers began to notice something odd. When the office staff went to deliver attendance sheets for the day, they couldn't find any record of Ms. Gray's assignment. Her name wasn't on the list. The substitute system had never logged her. The secretary, uneasy, called the district office. They confirmed no substitute had been dispatched to Ridgeway Middle that day. Yet, when the secretary peeked into room 12, there she was, Ms. Gray, standing at the board, teaching a room of quiet, attentive students. The secretary remembered the way Ms. Gray turned her head, as though she'd known she was being watched. Her smile, she said, was too wide. That was when the office staff decided to call the principal. The principal's check, Principal Lawrence, was a pragmatic man. He'd dealt with pranksters, imposters, even the occasional parent who slipped into the building without clearance. He assumed this was a paperwork mix-up, but when he stepped into room 12, the atmosphere struck him immediately. The students sat unnaturally still, hands folded on their desks. No one whispered, no one shifted. They stared at the board with blank expressions as if under a spell. And Ms. Gray, she greeted him with a warmth that felt forced. "Everything is under control," she said softly. Lawrence glanced at the board. The symbols covering it meant nothing to him. "May I have a word in the hall?" he asked. Ms. Gray didn't move. She simply smiled again. "I'm afraid the lesson isn't finished." Something in her tone made him hesitate. Against his better judgment, Lawrence stepped back out and closed the door. Later, he would tell investigators that the moment he left the room, his heart began pounding in his chest for no reason he could explain. Growing unease among students. As the day continued, students began noticing stranger details. Her handwriting changed with each lesson. Sometimes neat cursive, sometimes jagged block letters, sometimes looping symbols no one could decipher. Her name on the board seemed to shift too. A few swore that between classes it no longer said Miss Gray, but instead resembled something else, letters rearranged into a word none of them recognized. "It was like it was breathing," one girl later said. Like the chalk itself was alive. By sixth period, the students were whispering openly. Who was she? Why was she here? And more importantly, why wasn't anyone stopping her? The list that didn't exist by late afternoon, the staff's concern reached a breaking point. The secretary pulled up every database she had access to. District records, HR files, state certification listings. There was no Ms. Gray. No one by that name had ever applied, been hired, or worked as a substitute in their district. When they checked the visitor logs, the entry for the day was blank. And yet, dozens of students were sitting in room 12 under her watchful gaze. The secretary later admitted that for the rest of the day, she avoided the classroom entirely. The idea of confronting Ms. Gray filled her with an inexplicable dread. The midpoint discovery. The turning point came when one brave teacher decided to slip into the classroom after dismissal. Her name was Mrs. Alvarez, an English teacher who had always prided herself on protecting her students. She waited until the last bell rang, until the halls emptied, and then she stepped into room 12. The room was empty, no students, no teacher. But the chalkboard was still covered in symbols, dozens of them spiraling inward toward the center like a vortex. And on the desk at the front of the room lay a neat stack of papers, attendance sheets. But when Alvarez picked them up, her stomach turned to ice, because the columns didn't list student names. They listed dates, dates of death. Some had already passed, some were years into the future. But beside each, written in that shifting, impossible handwriting, were the names of her students. And it was in that moment, staring down at the attendance sheets, that Mrs. Alvarez realized the horrifying truth. Ms. Gray hadn't come to teach. She hadn't come to substitute. She had come to take roll of the dead. Mrs. Alvarez stood alone in the classroom, clutching the stack of papers, her heart pounding so violently she could feel it in her throat. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but she knew it was wrong, deeply, impossibly wrong. And then, behind her, the door clicked shut. When she turned, Ms. Gray was there. No footsteps, no sound of entry. Just there. Her glasses were gone now, revealing eyes that didn't seem to focus. They shimmered faintly, as if reflecting light that wasn't in the room. "Those aren't for you," Ms. Gray said softly, pointing at the papers. Alvarez's instinct screamed at her to drop them, but her hands tightened instead. "What is this?" she demanded. Ms. Gray tilted her head. "You wouldn't understand. None of you ever do." Alvarez backed toward the door but found it locked. She hadn't heard the lock turn. It simply was. And then Ms. Gray smiled. Not cruelly, not warmly, but with a kind of detached inevitability. "The list is never wrong." The next morning, whispers flooded the school. Some students said Ms. Gray hadn't left the classroom all night. Others swore they saw her standing at the window long after dark, staring out across the empty parking lot. No one could explain how she entered the building that morning either. The custodian insisted all doors had been locked, yet by first period, she was already at the chalkboard, writing. And once again, her attendance sheet appeared filled, but not with names. This time, some students swore they glimpsed their own birthdays, followed by something else scribbled beside them. When asked later, none of them could bring themselves to repeat what they'd seen. Staff intervention. By mid-morning, the faculty had reached a breaking point. The principal called an emergency meeting with the office staff and 2 veteran teachers. Alvarez, still shaken, brought the papers she'd found. They laid them out on the conference table. The dates and names stared back at them like a ledger. One teacher whispered, "But that date, that was when Michael died, the car accident last year." Another pointed, "And this one hasn't happened yet." The room fell silent. Finally, Principal Lawrence stood, face pale. "We need to remove her. Today." Together, the staff marched down the hallway toward room 12. Through the window, they saw Ms. Gray at the board again, her back to the class, the chalk scraping in endless loops. The students sat eerily still, eyes glazed, as if mesmerized. Lawrence opened the door. "Ms. Gray, I need you to come with us." She didn't turn. She kept writing, faster now, symbols slashing across the board. "I said," he began. But then she spoke. Not to him, to the students. "Stay seated. Don't move." Every child froze, hands locked on desks, bodies stiff, as if chained to their chairs. Lawrence felt the air thicken, pressing on his lungs. He tried again, forcing the words out. "You are not authorized to be here. You need to leave." Finally, Ms. Gray turned. Her eyes were no longer human at all. They were deep, endless pits, swirling faintly with light like stars in a night sky. And she whispered, almost gently, "I was here long before you. I'll be here long after. The lights flickered, the air hummed with static. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The chalkboard was empty. The stack of attendance sheets vanished. The students blinked, confused, as if waking from a dream. But the teachers in the doorway knew better. They had seen her. They had heard her. And the memory of those endless, impossible eyes would never leave them. In the weeks that followed, Ridgeway Middle School carried on as though nothing had happened. Officially, the incident was chalked up to a misunderstanding, a clerical error, an unknown substitute. But the students whispered. They remembered her perfectly, her voice, her handwriting, the way she said their names like she had always known them. Some of them claimed the dates they saw on the sheets haunted them. One boy stopped riding in cars entirely after seeing his death date beside a sketch of a twisted steering wheel. Another girl refused to walk home alone, convinced the date she saw corresponded to something stalking her in the woods. And then the first student died. A freak accident. A fall down a staircase at home. The date matched perfectly with what had been written on the sheet Alvarez recovered. That was when fear turned into silence. No one spoke of Ms. Gray again. Years later, when Ridgeway closed its doors permanently due to declining enrollment, a team arrived to pack up old files. In a locked cabinet in the main office, they found one final envelope. No one could explain how it had gotten there. It wasn't labeled, and no key matched the lock. Inside were a dozen sheets of paper, and on each more dates, more names. But these weren't the names of students. They were the names of the teachers who had tried to remove Ms. Gray that day. Principal Lawrence, Mrs. Alvarez, the secretary, each with a date neatly printed beside it. Some had already passed. Others were still to come. And across the bottom of the final sheet, in letters that shifted and curled even as the investigators stared, was a single phrase: "The list is never wrong." To this day, no one knows who or what Ms. Gray really was. But the teachers who were there still look over their shoulders, wondering when their dates will come due. And the students who sat in room 12, they carry with them a memory they can't explain, of a substitute teacher who wasn't supposed to be there, a substitute who knew their names, their futures, and their ends, the substitute who wasn't on the list, but who kept one of her own.